Hello, I'm Christopher Winn.
And I'm Tom Harper.
Welcome to That Wilbur Smith Show,
A podcast about the life, the world, and the legacy of the legendary adventure writer Wilbur Smith. Since he had first rounded Good Hope, Tom had come in regular contact with the slavers and their victims. During their long wait in Zanzibar roads, there had always been slave ships anchored close to them, near enough for the stink and heartbreaking sounds to carry clearly to where the Swallow was lying. Each day now he walked with Abolition through the slave compounds, and it was more difficult to ignore the misery all around them. The wailing of children torn from their parents' arms, the weeping of bereaved mothers, and the dumb suffering in the dark eyes of young men and women deprived of their free existence, chained like animals, abused in a language they did not understand, spread-eagled on the whipping block, flogged with the vicious hippo-hide kiboko until their ribs showed white in the wounds. The very thought of making a profit out of the torment of these lost souls made the bile rise in the back of Tom's throat.
That was a reading from Wilbur Smith's novel Monsoon, which is a swashbuckling adventure of marauders and slave traders, love and treasure, set at the end of the 17th century against the backdrop of the Indian Ocean slave trade, a subject that for some reason has received surprisingly little attention in comparison to the Atlantic slave trade. And we're honoured to be joined today by one of the leading experts on the Indian Ocean slave trade, Professor Bernard K. Freamon. Now, Professor Freamon is Professor of Law at the Roger Williams School of Law, Rhode Island, and Professor of Law Emeritus at Seton Hall Law School, Newark, New Jersey.
He served as co-editor of a collection of essays entitled Indian Ocean Slavery in the Age of Abolition, and is the author of the groundbreaking book Possessed by the Right Hand, The Problem of Slavery in Islamic Law and Muslim Culture, which was the first comprehensive legal history of slavery in Islam ever published. He's also authored an essay entitled Slavery in Society in East Africa, Oman and the Persian Gulf, which is absolutely the world of Monsoon and the novels in that series, published in 2018 by the Cambridge University Press. So, Professor Freamon, welcome to That Wilbur Smith Show.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here.
So, I had all sorts of questions prepared, but actually the first one I want to ask you is tell me about your hat.
Oh, well, this hat is called, in the Arabic, it's called kufi, but it has many names, but it's a hat that I purchased many years ago when I was living in Zanzibar. And it's a fairly typical hat that many Zanzibar men wear, that I tend to only wear it now on special occasions, but I consider this to be a special occasion. I wear it during the day and sometimes at night and at the mosque. And the Zanzibar hats are quite unique in the way that they are sewn together and how the designs that the Zanzibaris use. And so it's pretty recognizable in the Muslim world as a hat from Zanzibar.
Is that right? Because I'm going to attempt to describe this for our listeners. It's, I guess, a pillbox hat. So it's got no brim and a flat top. And it's in this lovely cream-coloured fabric with a band of green stitching around it, and then embroidered with these green, I guess, stylized leaf shapes, a bit like trefoils in Western art. And it's just incredibly distinctive and very, very elegant.
Yeah, I like it very much.
Yeah, well, we're honoured that this was a special enough occasion for you to wear it. And of course, a Zanzibar hat could not be more appropriate for the topic we're discussing today.
Yeah.
Chris mentioned in the intro that the Indian Ocean slave trade gets far less attention, certainly, I think, in the popular discourse than the Atlantic slave trade gets. I'm curious, what drew you to this subject?
Well, I'm a Muslim. I'm an African-American Muslim. I became a Muslim in college during the time of the civil rights movement, the murder of Malcolm X, the rise of the following of Muhammad Ali, the boxer, and other things that influenced many African Americans to look into Islam. So I became Muslim. And then And then I traveled, I became a professor of law. I became a lawyer and then a professor of law, and was teaching at Seton Hall. And I took a sabbatical and traveled and took 2 years teaching at the University of Nairobi in Nairobi, Kenya. And in 1986, just really on a vacation, I traveled to Zanzibar. Zanzibar is a very popular vacation site, both for people in East Africa, all over the Indian Ocean world, and even people in Europe and Asia. It has quite a big tourist trade that comes there. And I went there as a tourist. And in Islam, most people are taught that Islam abhors slavery, that Islam has a very strong egalitarian ethic that's connected with the religion. And so most Muslims think that Islam was anti-slavery and was an anti-slavery kind of religious ideology. When I got to Zanzibar, I was confronted with this very deep, as I described it, and complex history that actually the Muslims had been involved in a very extensive and long-term slave trade in the Indian Ocean, and a trade in Africans, but not just Africans, but mostly Africans. And that Zanzibar was an entrepot of that slave trade and a center of the slave trade. And as Wilbur Smith described in the excerpt that you read, and I was like, as an African American, I have always had an interest in slavery, and I teach civil rights and things like that. But I'd never really had any experience in doing scholarly work in American slavery, although I'm a descendant of American slaves. But when I got to Zanzibar, being a Muslim, this fascinated me, that the Zanzibar's role in the Indian Ocean slave trade. And so I began research on really two main topics. One, just the relationship between slavery and Islam or Islamic law, and then more specifically, the details with respect to slavery in East Africa and in the Indian Ocean world. And so I began to do research on it after I got back to the United States. And in 1998 was the first article. It took me about 12 years to put this research, the first set of research together. So I published an article in the Harvard Human Rights Journal on slavery and Islam in 1998. And then after that, I published a series of other articles and book chapters on slavery. One of the books that you mentioned has gotten quite a good press, as well as the second book, the book on it's called Indian Ocean Slavery in the Age of Abolition, that abolition did not work as well as people wanted it to work in the Indian Ocean. And then that culminated in the book that I've just published in 2019. So it's become, it really became, it gave me a scholarly agenda to travel to Zanzibar on vacation. And I'm very happy that that happened. I'm not happy that slavery happened, but I'm happy that I was able to learn and publish material on it.
Yeah, it's funny. We've had a few scholars on the program, and it's amazing how many of them the passion is fired by a trip kind of early in their life, where being in the place is what really inspires them to take up their field of study. And I think it really speaks to the importance of place in really kind of getting hold of our imaginations, which of course Wilbur Smith understood so well.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I encourage students who are interested in this topic to do the same thing, to travel to places like Zanzibar, Egypt, Iran, if the Iranians will let you go there, India, North Africa. There are many places where, if you're interested in this topic, there's Turkey. There's a good, it's a good field. And if someone is doing Islamic studies, slavery is also understudied in Islamic studies. Many people that teach Islamic law and teach Islamic studies ignore or don't want to talk about slavery. And so it's not just in the regular mainstream or Western European academic discourse, but also in Islamic discourse. Slavery is understudied, and the problem of slavery is understudied. That's why I wrote my second book.
It's interesting that both Christianity and Islam are said to believe in the individual as created by God, but both indulged in and indeed profited by their involvement in the slave trade. And I can't talk for Christians, but how do Muslims justify their involvement in slavery?
Well, that's a good question. The Quran recognizes and accepts slavery as a fact of both social and economic and legal life. So if a Muslim who studies the Quran will see references to slavery, there's quite a bit of regulation of slavery in the Quran. Now, I have argued in several places, and I think most people agree. Some don't agree, but I think a great majority of Muslims agree that the Quran puts forward what I call an emancipatory ethic. In other words, to emancipate slaves and to free slaves, chapter 90 of the Quran specifically talks about this, is considered to be a pious and a worthy act for the human being. In fact, chapter 90 says, it's addressed to the Prophet Muhammad. It's from God to the Prophet Muhammad. And it says, you should know there are two roads in life, a high road and an easy road. And it's the high road that's difficult. Most people take the easy path when they're confronted with questions in life, but the Quran recommends that you take the more difficult path in life. And then it asks the question, what are the things that make that high path more difficult? One of the things, it talks about other things, but one of the things it talks about is the emancipation of slaves. That it's not easy to emancipate slaves and to move toward what some Muslims argue that the Quran God wanted to eventually lead us to a slavery-free society. Because it said in the high road, if you take the high road, you will emancipate slaves. But on the other hand, there are lots of regulations in the Quran that would say also to a Muslim who's learning this, that slavery is accepted by God as a fact of life. So how to marry, who can be married to a slave, why should you, and if so, why should you marry a slave? What does it mean to be emancipated? Who should be the object of charity? If we're going to give charity, if we're going to have a way in society to give charity, who should be an object of charity? And among the objects of charity are people who are enslaved. And so there are a number of places in the Quran where it has this emancipatory ethic, but at the same time, it accepts slavery as a fact of life. Now, in the life of the Prophet Muhammad, which is the other example that Muslims look to, and also that scholars look to in developing the law, the Prophet Muhammad also was involved with slavery. It's an uncomfortable fact for many Muslims to acknowledge, but he was given two women as slaves while he was during his prophethood. He gave away one of them, but the other he kept. And he had a relationship with her, and she bore a child by him. And so he also, as everyone else at that time that he was living, accepted slavery as a fact, as he did. And he eventually emancipated her, but he never married her. And on his deathbed, and my book makes this point, the book Possessed by the Right Hand, which has recently been published, on his deathbed, he was asked, what should we be, because he knew he was going to die. People around him knew he was dying. He had lived a very exemplary and amazingly important life. And so they wanted to know from him, what should we be concerned about after your death? And he said two things: establishing prayer, making prayer, that religion remains in public life, and those who your right hands possess, which in Arabic is said, ma malakat aymanukum, which the Quran uses that phrase to describe slaves. Those who your right hands possess, make sure that they are taken care of, that we have a concern for them. And so even the Prophet Muhammad, in his teaching and in his statements to his followers, advanced what I call this emancipatory ethic, this idea that really the message from both the Quran and from the Prophet Muhammad's life is that slavery is a special problem in society, special problem for Islam, which requires special solutions. And so that is pretty much an answer to your question. What's uncomfortable for many Muslims, and it's the problem that I try to deal with in my book, is that unlike in the Western world, there was no abolition. The Americans fought a civil war, and the American adopted an amendment to the Constitution. It was a difficult problem for the Americans in the early American advance, and eventually the 13th Amendment was adopted, abolishing slavery. That did not happen in Islamic law, and one of the things that I'm concerned with is whether or not there can be an abolition, or should be, and if there should be, and the second question is, can there be, and how would that happen to make an abolition of slavery now? Because there are some Muslims, like ISIS recently, Boko Haram in Nigeria. There's an insurgency called Abu Sayyaf in the Philippines. There are several Muslim insurgencies, and the conservatives who are giving legal advice to those insurgents say you can enslave captives as the product of war now. And so there's a concern that there should be an abolition of that remedy. Slavery is one of the remedies when one captures someone in war. You enslave them. That's an ancient remedy in almost all systems of war. It was abolished in the West, abolished by the British, abolished by the Americans, and eventually, although it took a little longer, abolished by the French, the Spanish, and the Portuguese, the European big nations that brought about the advance of the West. But that did not happen in the Muslim world.
It's amazing to hear you talk about this as a live issue. I mean, because obviously in Wilbur's books, and certainly in my mind, this is a historic issue. And I think to think that actually this, a form of it continues into the present day is really sobering. I do want to go back a bit into the history of it, though, because one of the things that interests me is when I think of Atlantic slavery, and I think, where did these people go? I get very, very clear images in my mind. I can think of either a cotton plantation or a sugarcane plantation in the Caribbean, and these kind of mass, sort of almost industrialized processes of slave labor. When I think about Indian Ocean slavery, I can sort of imagine the slaves in the slave markets in Zanzibar or wherever they might have been, as Wilbur describes. I don't really have a very clear sense then of where they go and what they do once they've been enslaved. So what is the kind of the economy that slavery is serving?
Well, there was a variety, like in the West, although more diversity of labor occupations in the Indian Ocean than in the West. In the West, generally, it was plantation slavery, largely plantation slavery, sometimes domestic servitude, and sometimes in what's called, I would call gang slavery, which is working in a mine or working in some sort of other project, building a dam or building a road, those kinds of things. In the Indian Ocean, it was much a similar variety, but not the big emphasis on plantation slavery. There was plantation slavery in Zanzibar and on the East African coast to some extent. Plantations for things like coconuts, sugar, sometimes in Egypt, cotton, and other plantations, agricultural projects like that. But the most common, in my book, I described there are really 5 occupations that slaves generally occupied in labor in the Indian Ocean world. And the first and most common was domestic household slavery. A person who takes care of children, keeps the house clean, acts as a kind of butler or washer person in the house and doing domestic jobs. The overwhelming number of slaves in the Indian Ocean world had that occupation. So when they were exported from Zanzibar, generally by Muslims, generally it was the Muslims who exported the slaves from Zanzibar. Some who stayed in Zanzibar worked on the plantations in Zanzibar or in domestic work. But those who were exported generally were exported for domestic tasks in the Arab world, in India, and even as far away as Southeast Asia, and even maybe a little bit in China, but mostly Southeast Asia, India, and the Arab world, and North Africa, also Turkey as well. The second most common occupation was actually something that would surprise you. It was the military slave, the person who acted as what in Arabic is called a mamluk, a person who is used as a military guard, a soldier, a sailor on a boat, or other military occupation. That was quite common. Thirdly, women were used as concubines. There's a word in Arabic, sariya, and there are many other words that describe a woman who's just held for basically sexual gratification of the owner, generally a man. Technically, a woman could own a man for that same purpose, but it was very rare that happened because it's socially not acceptable kind of behavior. But oftentimes women then were, especially young girls, were captured and transported across the ocean to be sold in the market or to be purchased by someone as a concubine to serve as a sexual object. And that person generally did not do other forms of work. That was their sole and exclusive occupation. The fourth is like what we see in the West, what I call gang slavery, which is working on agricultural plantation, working in a mine, getting salt in places where you gather salt and other things like that. What's also not well known is that in Iraq, in the 9th century, the slaves who were working in the salt marshes near Basra at the top of the Persian Gulf revolted, and there was a slave government, a government of revolting slaves, escaped slaves, that ran that area for about 100 years and was finally put down by the Abbasid Caliphate. But and I think many people say the reason for the revolt was because of the horrific nature of the conditions that the mostly African slaves engaged in. And then the last form of slavery, at least that's most commonly encountered in the Indian Ocean world, is what I call sultanic or an elite slavery. You could classify Mamluks as a form of elite slavery as well, the military slave as an elite slave, but you had other forms of elite slavery. People that had specialized knowledge, doctors, lawyers, architects, poet, artist, and other accountant, other people that were of very important use to the leader. That's why I call it a sultanic slave, because that person is owned either by the state or by the leader of the state and is in a very preferred and important position. Like oftentimes a eunuch, a castrated male, is considered to be an elite slave in the Islamic approach to slavery, although it doesn't legally acknowledge the fact that a eunuch, that you could castrate a male, but the castrated male who survives the castration oftentimes very much has a very important position as treasurer or as a musician or as an artist or as keeper of the concubines or other kind of very trusted position is oftentimes castrated male. So there was an industry that developed in India, in the Arab world, and also in Africa, which involved the castration of young men, usually young men, and then they were sold into slavery. Oftentimes they're castrated. In Turkey also this happened. They were castrated after they were captured in slavery and then put in very preferred positions. That's a small number of people. There were eunuchs, they're called, but there were some. Islam is not the only culture that used castrated men in slavery. The Chinese culture also did that. Southeast Asia, you found eunuchs as well, but Islam the Muslims accepted that as a form of slavery, even though technically it was illegal under the Quranic and Prophet Muhammad's edicts, because you're not supposed to castrate or mutilate the human body. That's a prohibited act in Islamic law. And so for a Muslim to be involved in the castration of someone is illegal, should be illegal. So what the Muslims would do, this happened in Egypt quite a bit, is they would delegate or subcontract the castration part to a Christian or a Jewish person and have that person accomplish the task and then buy the slave from that person who manufactured the eunuch. That's a kind of it's a little prurient to talk about it. And some people like to talk about it. It was not a major part of the Indian Ocean slave trade, but it was a part of it.
Was it true that slaves could rise to positions of power?
Yes. In fact, that's a very good question, especially in the places where the Mamluks were employed. An emancipated Mamluk could become the head of state. That's an emancipated military slave could become the head of state. Also, among the elite slaves, first of all, in Islam, a slave could own another slave. So a slave might actually be in a position where he would be the commander of a military regiment, or the head of the treasury, or the head of a unit of government that was important, the tax collector, those kinds of things. So yes, slavery did not have, in the Islamic approach to society, did not have the stigma that was associated with it in the West. Like Barack Obama's election as president, although Barack Obama actually did not have any slavery in his history, but his wife was a descendant of slaves. Everybody thought that was really a big deal. But that happened. People who had a history of slavery or came from the slave portion of society oftentimes would rise to become the head of state, generally after emancipation. There are some famous people who had been enslaved. Ibn Tulun in Egypt is probably the best example. There's a mosque in Egypt called the Ibn Tulun Mosque that he commissioned to have built by an architect in 800 AD, very early in the Islamic era, and it still survives today. It's a museum. It was through earthquakes, through floods, through all kinds of other calamities that happened, the mosque has survived. And Ibn Tulun had come from Iraq and had been a slave in Iraq and rose to be head of state in Egypt. And there's some other famous people who eventually became heads of state. For example, in Zanzibar, the most important of the sultans of Zanzibar, other than the first sultan, was a man named Bargash. And Bargash's mother was a slave, an Ethiopian slave. And he's the sultan who eventually closed the slave market in Zanzibar. The historians now give him credit for eliminating lawfulness of slavery in Zanzibar, and he came from slave origins. But that did not stop him from becoming the Sultan of Zanzibar, although the British actually weren't happy with him as Sultan for other reasons, because he wasn't really a big fan of the British. But he became Sultan of Zanzibar, and that's another example. And there's several other examples. Malik Embar, who ran a state in India, near Gujarat in India, had been an Ethiopian slave and had been sold into slavery 2 or 3 times before he ended up as the slave of the Sultan in Gujarat. And then, when the Sultan died, he became the Sultan and ran that state. There are pictures of him that hang in the Victoria and Albert Museum in Britain, and I have a picture of him in my book. A very important figure in Western Indian history who had been a slave and rose to be head of state.
It's striking, isn't it? You said that there was commentary when Michelle Obama became First Lady, but that's like 150 years after slavery's been abolished in America. It's striking that in a society which continues to have slavery and the slave trade and this whole kind of economy, that these people can just sort of flip from slave to, not just from slave to free, but from slave to head of state. Does that speak to the fact that it is a more complex, the position of slaves and slavery in these societies is more complex than it is, say, in the American South, where it is quite literally black and white? I get the impression from your writing that there's different ways of being a slave and different kind of legal constructs around it. Is that fair?
I think that's fair. I think the word complex is not. I think the position of being a slave in the West was also complex. The ownership relationship, the relationship between slave and owner, was much, I think you're right, simpler and more direct. Whereas, see, for example, the Quran is very explicit about this. The slave is a human being. Whereas in the Western concept, the slave is property and only property. Whereas in the Islamic complex, the slave is a piece of property, but also a human being. And if the slave becomes Muslim, then the slave gets rights that all other Muslims have because of the recognition of the slave's humanity. It doesn't give the right to emancipation. That's kind of a little paradox. But it makes it easier if the person wants to emancipate that slave, that they are Muslim. And so the obligations and the responsibilities that a Muslim has towards other Muslims are also obligations that the slave would have as well. So the recognition of the slave's humanity then gives rise to rules that make the relationship, I think complex is the wrong word. It's complex, especially for an outsider looking at it, but it is just more elaborate. There's more of an elaborate relationship. I think that's a better word, although I may be just being a wordsmith here and slicing.
We like wordsmiths on this podcast.
So but it's an elaborate relationship. So if you have a military slave, for example, this person knows all about weapons, about the knowledge of how to make war. And at any point, that person who is your military could eliminate you when you're asleep, just to cut your throat, and it's over. And sometimes that happened. But because of the nature of slavery and the fact that the Mamluk might really get a lot of benefit in society from being in that position, they might very well accept the position as a chief military slave or a person who is in charge of 100 men or 500 men or that kind of thing. The Janissaries, the power they had in the Turkish entity, the Ottoman entity, and the history that connected with the Janissaries is another example. Very powerful people, even though they are technically enslaved.
Now, where did the African slaves come from mainly? In Wilbur's books, they're brought down the Zambezi from the countries of Central Africa, and then to the Swahili coast, and then across to Zanzibar, to the markets there. Did they come from all over Africa?
They did come from all over Africa. It depends on the part of Africa that you talk about. In East Africa, yes, not just the Zambezi River, but the whole area of Tanzania, what's now Tanzania and Kenya, along the lakes, running north along the lakes. So there are several lakes going up to what's called Lake Victoria, where raiding parties would go capture men and women and children and bring them to the coast, and then bring them across the coast to Zanzibar. There's also a place in the south of Tanzania, which is called Kilwa, which had actually 2 or 3 slave markets there. Sometimes the slave markets were also on the coast. Bagamoyo in Tanzania, and then also Mombasa in Kenya and Malindi in Kenya and Lamu in Kenya. They all had slave markets. So not everybody came over to Zanzibar, but many did. In the West African history, it was similar, and they were brought to the coast from the interland, but there were castles and factories kept on the coast by the Portuguese, by the French, by the British, especially Ghana, Togo, Benin, Senegal, what's now Senegal, and then exported from the coast. And they also came from from what geographers call the hinterlands, the inner part of West Africa. There are also slaves that were transported across the Sahara Desert from the Sahel, which is just below the Sahara Desert. So places like Mali, Chad, Sudan, Mauritania, those places also gave Africans into trading routes, and the trading routes were developed and moved across the Sahara Desert to the northern cities, cities like Benghazi, like Tripoli, like Tunis in Tunisia, Cairo, and Tangier in the west. And from there, they were exported either across the Mediterranean or along the coast toward. A lot of slaves were brought to Cairo because Cairo was a big market. One of the largest slave markets in the history of slavery existed in Cairo, Egypt.
And how many people are we talking? I'm thinking particularly of because obviously, again, the figures for the Atlantic slave trade are pretty well publicized. But in the Indian Ocean slave trade, what sort of numbers are we talking of people?
I would not dare to give a definitive answer on that. It's a very controversial question as to what the numbers are. The general number that's estimated it depends on the period of time that you're talking about. The general number estimated for the transatlantic slave trade is about 11 million. I actually think for the Indian Ocean slave trade, the number is larger. But that's because the Indian Ocean slave trade extended over a much longer period of time. So you had a slave trade that actually goes back all the way to the time of the pharaoh Hatshepsut. Hatshepsut ruled Egypt in about, I don't want to be exact with numbers, around 1800 BC. On her mortuary temple in Luxor, Egypt, is a depiction of a expedition to East Africa to bring back from East Africa animals, skins, fruit, and the argument is made, there are other places in Egyptian wall paintings that slaves were brought back from East Africa. So if you start the Indian Ocean slave trade with the efforts of the Egyptians to bring Africans into Egypt, that's about at least 1800 BC. Then what happens, I had wrote down here, and see if I can get it. I have a little history here that I can tell you about. There's a book called The Periplus of the Erythraean Sea. The Erythraean Sea is another way that the Indian Ocean was described. That was written by a Greek mariner, an anonymous mariner, in about the 2nd century AD, 2 centuries after Christ. And in that, it's an instruction book for mariners who are doing the Indian Ocean naval work. And in that book, he describes how to buy a slave, where you can buy slaves, and how the slaves were exported. Now, the numbers we just don't have. No one knows whether it's 50 a year, 500 a year, 5,000 a year. We just don't know. And the books, the little snippets of archaeological and literary evidence that we have don't give us an idea of numbers. Now, there was a Muslim traveler who traveled to the East African world and the Indian Ocean world named Ibn Battuta. He was a Moroccan, and he was a scholar, and he wrote down and published an account of his travels. And he traveled from Arabia over to Sudan and Ethiopia. He traveled down, all the way down to Tanzania, and then he traveled also, the argument runs based on his descriptions, to the Persian Gulf and even maybe to India. And he talks about quite large numbers of people on boats being transported in slavery, 100, 200 on a boat. So, and then there's other literature that gives a similar number. So if you take the Indian Ocean slave trade from the time of the Egyptians up to the end of the slave trade, which is the 20th century, slave trade in the Indian Ocean really doesn't end until the 20th century. You may be talking maybe 15 million, 12 million. I don't want someone writing me, hate mail and saying, you're wrong. It was only, 5 million. I'm not prepared to argue the numbers, but it's a large number, not a small number, a number that's comparable to the transatlantic slave trade. And because in the transatlantic slave trade, we now have database, thanks to a guy named David Eltis, another scholar named Richardson, the work of David Bryan Davis, and other transatlantic historians. They were able, because the Europeans kept records, and they would write down the voyages and record the voyages. The Muslims did not do that with any degree of regularity. And so there's now talk of trying to get an Indian Ocean slave trade database established, but the numbers are much more difficult to be certain about.
Well, you've sort of answered this question already, but do you think the treatment of slaves in the Indian Ocean was as bad as it was in the Atlantic slave trade? I mean, there are those dreadful stories of people being packed into ships like sardines, and half of them dying on the voyage across the Atlantic, and then some being thrown overboard even. Do you think the treatment of slaves in the Indian Ocean was as bad as that?
I think so. I think that, well, first of all, the boat that was used in the Indian Ocean slave trade was completely different. Now, you have European slave trading, first of all, in the Indian Ocean. So the Europeans used similar ships that were used in the transatlantic in the Indian Ocean. My good friend Richard Allen has written a very good book called European Slave Trading in the Indian Ocean. But the Muslims and Indians, sometimes Hindus or other religions but mostly Muslims in the Indian Ocean, used a boat that's called a dhow, which is a lateen sailboat, a lateen sail on a mast, a triangular sail, which was smaller than the European boat, but faster and much more maneuverable in terms of its moving across the ocean. So it took about 25 days for a dhow to travel between Zanzibar and Oman or into the Persian Gulf. So in that 25-day period, and there are records that establish this, oftentimes the British, when they established a picket to try to capture these slave boats, because slavery became illegal internationally in the late 19th century, mid to late 19th century. So when they would capture a boat, they would find very similar evidence of horrific conditions. People, and there are photographs of Africans emaciated. Oftentimes, if the slaver thought that he was going to get captured, he would throw the slaves over the side to avoid evidence, avoid being charged with slave trading. So there was quite a bit of, cruelty on the ocean. Once the slave arrived, if they survived what's called the Middle Passage, in the transatlantic history, that's called the Middle Passage. In the Muslim history, there are about 4 or 5 Middle Passages. Remember, there's also the passage across the Sahara. There's also the passage on the trip to Mecca and the Red Sea. There's the Indian Ocean Passage, as well as other places where people were transported in captivity. You have, yes, a lot of cruelty. The Sahara Desert is a horrific place. If they run out of water, if the person transporting slaves runs out of water, the first person to be abandoned on the desert is the slave. He's going to abandon the slave before he abandons his own crew, if there's a limited amount of water. And it's not a good idea to be abandoned in the middle of the Sahara Desert without water or food or medicine if you're injured or the like. There's also slave trading routes from Sudan up the Nile River. Up the Nile River is another passage for among the slave trading was done among Muslims, and it's a similar kind of thing. And descriptions are given of people packed in boats. Now, can you say it's not really a good exercise to say, in my view, well, this is not. A lot of apologists for Islamic slavery want to say that. Well, it really wasn't as cruel as transatlantic slavery. And I think that's a useless argument because one person dying from lack of water or being thrown over the side of a boat or dying from starvation or dying because of injury and not being able to be treated for their injury is one too many. So it's not really a very useful thing to say, well, this passage or this practice was more cruel than the other. It was all cruel, all of it. And Muslims, that's one of my arguments that I make in my book, that Muslims have to understand and own the fact that people acting in the name of their religion were just as cruel as people who did slavery in other places. You know, we could call the transatlantic slavery Christian slavery because it was the Christian nations that did it. But we don't do that. We call it the transatlantic slavery. But people in the Indian Ocean, oftentimes some people who want to argue that it was really bad, want to describe it as Muslim slavery or Islamic slavery. And I prefer to say the same thing, to use the geographic term. It's Indian Ocean slavery or trans-Saharan slavery or trans-Mediterranean slavery. But it's all bad. The Mediterranean might have been a little better because it's a shorter trip. It's only one day to cross the Mediterranean at most. But to cross the Indian Ocean from Zanzibar to the Arab world, it's about 25 days. If you're going to India, it's even maybe 30, 35 days. If the monsoon winds, and that's what drives those boats, the monsoon winds, if they were favorable to you.
Hence the title of Wilbur's novel, of course, Monsoon.
Yes.
Yeah. We've mentioned a few times the British, and obviously, eventually, having been great enthusiasts for the slave trade, eventually they come around and abolish it. Although one of the things I'd learned from your writing, which I'd never known before, was that when they abolished slavery in the empire in, I think it's 1833, they actually don't abolish it in India, in India that's controlled by the East India Company. And I thought that was such a fascinating detail that, even then there's like a little asterisk. It's not, we've mostly abolished it, but we're going to tolerate it a little bit longer in some other places, which was just amazing to me.
Yeah, I'm very glad you picked that up. That's something that's often overlooked, that there was an asterisk when the British abolished slavery. It's called the Abolition Act in 1833. Parliament passed it. You have this very, very important. They're called the Saints. Very important abolitionists in England. Thomas Clarkson, William Wilberforce. They really, convinced the parliamentarians to abolish slavery in all of the British dominions, except India, Ceylon, and St. Helena's Island. Why? The important question is why was India exempt? I call it the India exemption to British abolition. That's because India was really economically important to Britain, and so things like tea, sugar, opium, other kinds of commodities were produced using slavery in India and Ceylon. And so it would have really been, Wellington argued in the House of Lords that this would be an economic disaster if we abolished slavery in India. that it would. And also, he made this argument: the average Indian guy has about 2 or 3 slaves in his hut, and so we'll have resistance from the Indians if we abolish slavery. Therefore, we're not going to do it. But eventually, the Indian government, when it took over, did what's called a delegalization of slavery. It wasn't an abolition. There was never really an abolition of slavery in India until into the 20th century, late 19th century. But it was delegalized. In other words, slave markets were abolished, and a person who wanted to be emancipated could be emancipated. The owner could not refuse it. But if a person wanted to remain in slavery, that was lawful. I think it's 1864 where owning a slave becomes a crime in India.
Yeah.
Putting India aside for a moment, was there the equivalent in the Indian Ocean of the Atlantic West Africa Squadron, some sort of special force set up by the British to seize the slave ships and generally try and put a stop to the slave trade?
Yeah, that's fascinating. I don't recall now the exact name of the naval squadron, but there was the Admiralty in England took as the behest of the foreign minister and the head of the Admiralty took on the task of requisitioning and, in the naval terms, assigning boats to patrol, to set up what is called a picket, to patrol the Indian Ocean coast of East Africa and along the Omani coast and the Yemeni coast in the southern Arabian Peninsula over to India, a series of naval maneuvers and a squadron that would seek to end the slave trade. It's a complicated and very, I use the word elaborate, kind of set of facts that developed as a result of that. For example, when the Africans were captured, they weren't returned to Africa. Sometimes they were returned if it's right off the coast, but oftentimes they were taken to a place like Aden in southern Yemen, or Muscat in Oman, or Goa in India, and then basically a form of a mass adoption. They were put on into labor camps or given to people as domestic servants, or sometimes put in seminaries to learn religion. There were also South African labor camps that were developed. There's a famous case involved from Zanzibar, which I write about in my book, where these people were captured, and then it turned out that they came up with a story that they wanted to convince the British that they were mistreated in slavery. And the British consul, who's a man named Kirk, decided that that was a false story, that they were perfectly happy where they were. But there was nothing he could do about it because they had been transported away to South Africa to be put into labor camps in the colony in South Africa. And so the only thing the Admiralty told Kirk was, since you can't give the person back to the owner, we have to compensate the owner. The British approach to slavery oftentimes involved compensation, where if a slave is emancipated, it happened in the Caribbean, the slave owners were compensated, and they often did that as part of the naval effort as well. Also, a bounty was paid to the sailors for every slave that they captured. And the ship that was captured, the dhow usually, there was a cash reward given by the Admiralty for the capture of those ships. Sometimes the ship was in too bad a shape to be used, but sometimes you could auction it off. And that's a place where there could be more research as some of the stories, although books were written by some of those sailors. There's one called Dhow Chasing in Zanzibar Waters.
A book which presumably does what it says on the cover. I mean, is a perfect description.
Yeah, that book would be a bestseller today.
Yeah. Yeah. And I don't know about the state of academic research, but in Wilbur's novel, Falcon Flies, which you've looked at previously on the podcast, one of the heroes is the British captain of a ship on this picket, and he's got a steamship at this point, so it's 1860, and he's tearing up and down the coast of East Africa, absolutely taking down every slave dhow he can find, and as you say, getting quite a lot of money from it, because of course the Admiralty are paying him this bounty for it. So Wilbur's definitely immortalized that in fiction.
Yeah, steam shipping really changed it. The use of steam made the British boats much faster, and that really helped to end the illegal, at that time it was an illegal slave trade, because a dhow could not outrun a steamship, whereas it could outrun a sailboat, a regular British sailboat, as I understand it, as I understand the maritime technology involved in that.
It's interesting, as we've been talking, you talked about how in West Africa, obviously you've got the slave forts that are established by the French and the British and the Portuguese, and it's really dominated by these Western European nations. And I was just thinking that you said that one of your colleagues has written a book called European Slave Trading in the Indian Ocean, but it sounds like most of the trade is still being carried on by the local, mainly Muslim or Swahili population. And I'm curious as to why the Europeans, who are obviously in the Indian Ocean since the Portuguese get there in the late 15th century, why don't they muscle in on this trade much more? Why it seems odd that they would miss the opportunity to make a quick buck and actually leave this trade in the hands of the local population. Is there a reason that they don't get more involved and kind of monopolize that trade?
Well, I don't know. I'm not sure the answer to that. I think what drove the transatlantic slave trade was a tremendous economic explosion that was going on in the Western Hemisphere. That the Americas, Cuba, Brazil, it was just a tremendous, it's a new sort of world. That's what it was called, the New World, where you had all this tremendous economic opportunity. You don't have that in the Indian Ocean. India had been there for a long time, but there was no explosion like there was in the West. And so European slave trading in the Indian Ocean was mainly to bring people around and to bring people into the European world, whereas the Muslim slave trade had been going on before that and continued after the Europeans stopped. So it was more of a regular part of life rather than any kind of a capitalist explosion. Whereas in the West, you had a capitalist kind of explosion. There's a very good book by Eric Williams. It's called Capitalism and Slavery, who writes about the relationship between capitalism and slavery. And there's a different relationship in the Indian Ocean. That would be my answer.
That's fascinating. I'm sure that's right. I mean, ultimately, it comes down to the money, doesn't it?
Usually.
Follow the money. Yeah, I think the other thing that's really struck me is we've gone from ancient Egypt right through to the 20th century. We've covered the east coast of Africa. We've covered India, North Africa. We've touched a little bit on West Africa, which is obviously this incredible historical scope. Very aptly, it's also the canvas on which Wilbur Smith writes, because actually his books cover exactly that period. They cover pretty much the same geography. And indeed, sadly, in many of his books, slavery is part of the fabric of the societies he's writing about. And it's really sobering thinking how long this has been going on. And as you said earlier, the fact that even in some parts of the world, it survives, albeit in slightly different guises. So I think it's given us and our listeners an awful lot to think about.
Well, I think this has been an absolutely fascinating talk, and I really have learned so much about a subject that we really don't know enough about. So, Professor Freamon, it's been a real treat and a real privilege. And as I say, we've just learnt so much, so thank you very much for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me.
Thank you very much.
All right. You have a good day.
Thank you. So that's the end of our podcast for this episode. So it's goodbye from me, Christopher Winn.
And it's goodbye from me, Tom Harper.
That Wilbur Smith Show is produced by Christopher Winn. Music by Dewey DeLay. Executive producer, Niso Smith.